For the remainder of the video, we're going to concentrate on the various types of joinery that the JoinTech clincher system is capable of producing. Now, along with the clincher itself and all of the nice features that it has, one of the more important aspects of the system are the pre-printed templates that help you to do the various joints that you want to accomplish. Now, there are approximately 60+ templates that come with the system, anywhere from 1/4 inch joints up to 3/4 inch joints in box joints, dovetails, and the exotic joints, which are the double box joints, the double dovetails, and the box tails. Now, we're going to go through a process of looking at several different types of these joints for the remainder of the video. All of your templates have a convenient storage space in the back of the manual. There are a number of sleeved pages that will hold all of the templates that come with the system, plus allows you a few extra spots for any new templates that may come along in the future. Now, all the templates are essentially made alike, and that is they have a series of red and black lines on them. And these red and black lines indicate where the, if you will, tail and pins, to borrow from the dovetails, where the tail and pin cuts will be made. Now, the main difference that you'll find in the templates is that some of them just have red and black lines, and some of them have red and black lines, and then short black lines, and long black and short red lines, and some of them even have little yellow diamonds on them. At first, these can look rather intimidating, but once you become familiar with these templates and what these little marks mean, it's very easy to use them. Essentially, as I say, on this simple template here for a 1/2 inch dovetail, the red cut would be for, let's say, the tails, and the black cut would be made for the pins, or you could do the reverse depending on the spacing that you want. On this one that has a 5/8 box tail, this has several different types of marks on it. It has the red cuts for making the first one part of the joint. It has the dashed black lines for making another part of the joint. Then it has short lines, short black ones and short red ones. Generally, what those are for is for removing stock in between cuts when you're making the wider types of joints. You'll see this later on. The diamonds are for your centering, or alternate centering for symmetry. To give you an example, this cut right here was made on the 1/2 inch variable dovetail number 2. And you can see that we have essentially 3 wide tails and 2 narrow pins, and then 2 half pins. Now, by simply adjusting the center to one of these diamonds, we did the exact same operation, but it came out in reverse. Now we have 3 narrow tails and 2 wide pins and 2 wide half pins. So that is the purpose of the diamonds, is just to give you different types of symmetry on your joints. Now, all of your templates slide in to the clincher in any of the 3 slots that are machined into the body of the clincher. And there are a couple of joints where you use 2 templates at one time, so that's why there's more than one slot. Now, essentially, you just pick the slot you want and then very carefully push these in. Now, you want to take your time, because if you try to push too hard, you can crimp them, and you don't want to do that. If you find that it is too tough to slide this template in the first time around, what you can do is to take the template and slightly bow it like this down the length. just slightly bow it all the way down the length from the bottom side. And what that will do is it will make it so that it's just a little easier for that template to slide in. If you make it a little loose, you can take and sort of curl it back the other way and flatten it back out, and that will snug it back up just a little bit. So that is how you mount your template into the clincher. What we're going to look at now is how we achieve perfect symmetry on all of the joints that you can create with the JoinTech clincher system. Now, first of all, what we want to do is select the router bit that you're going to use for the project. Our first box that we're going to cut is a 1/2-inch box joint. So we have a 1/2-inch diameter router bit mounted in the router. Now what we do is we slide the fence forward until the insert just touches the edge of the router bit, the cutting edge of the router bit. Next, you look over to the true center and you move the true center until the diameter of the router bit is directly under the anti-parallax cursor. So I have a 1/2 inch on here, and I have the 1/2 inch mark directly under the cursor. Next, you slide the fence back away. You take your piece of stock to be machined, and you position it between the router bit and the face of the fence. You slide the fence forward until the fence touches the other edge of the stock. And that way the piece of wood is trapped between the two. Then you take the rabbet and you slide the rabbet over until the rabbet lines up with the carrot. And once the rabbet is lined up on the carrot, you will be able to achieve perfect symmetry. All you need to do now is remove your stock, slide the fence forward until the rabbet lines up directly under the cursor. When it's under the cursor, take the cam lock, bring it forward into the detent position, the 45-degree position, and now the gear inside is meshed so the fence can't move. Sometimes the rabbet will move slightly left or right of the hairline if you're not right at the center of the threads of the threaded rod that's in here. So what you'll need to do is use the micrometer adjustment and move the rabbet forwards or backwards a few thousandths of an inch, whatever it takes, to return the rabbet dead under the cursor. Once you've done that, your piece of stock will have true symmetry. Your board will be right dead on center of that piece of that router bit without ever having to take a ruler and measure anything on this board. To determine the proper location of your joints on your stock, what you do is take and measure the center of the board and just put a line on there. Then you can take and lay the board right over top the full-size picture on the appropriate template in the book. And that will give you an idea of exactly where your joints will be cut in the stock. So what we're going to do is we'll just pick that line right there just to have a line picked and say that is going to be the center of the joint. So we'll take and slide the template over until that particular dotted black line is right under the cursor, and that will be our center. And we can take and move the fence over so that we're on our beginning black line and lock the clincher in place. When making box joints, the first thing you want to do is to set the height or depth of the router bit slightly more than the thickness of the stock. That way when the joint is assembled, the fingers will stick out approximately a 1/16 or so on either side of the surfaces of the two pieces. And then you can come back and sand them down to fit. Now, all of your box joint cuts are made in the vertical position. So we will be using the vertical push fixture to hold the stock in place. I also use a piece of scrap stock on the back so that as the router bit passes through our good pieces, it doesn't splinter the stock badly. Also, to prevent going all the way through the scrap piece and possibly getting back into the base of the vertical push fixture, I run my piece of stock, or the pieces of stock, forward, and I look at the router bit down along the side of the piece of scrap stock until the router bit is about halfway into the scrap stock. Then I run the stop block forward just like that, and that way as I push my stock forward, it will stop and I don't go too far back into the material. And to hold everything in place, we use a clamp. Now, one thing that you have to be careful of is to make sure that your stock is down firmly against the table and in snugly against the face of the fence. If your stock is in any way crooked, then your joints will be crooked as well. Now, if you are making very heavy joints on the edge, what you might want to do is make 2 or 3 light cuts and sneak up until you get the full depth of cut. We're making a fairly light cut on the edge, so we'll take it off in one bite. Now, since we started on a black dashed line, all of our cuts for this series will be made by moving from black dashed line to black dashed line and locking in place and cutting. Now you can check the fit just by taking these two pieces and sliding them together. And even though they're offset because they're mating pieces or matching pieces, you can see that you have the proper fit on the corner. So what we want to do then is take and flip everything end for end. Clamp the stock in place again and repeat the same series of cuts on the opposite end of the stock. To make the matching pieces to fit, what we'll do is slide the clincher over to the first red mark that begins our opposite series of cuts. Turn our backup board around and then get our mating stock. Now what I generally do is mark one edge, and I keep that as the common edge against the fence. Now then, we'll take all of our pieces, and slide them together to make our box body. Now all of the boxes that we're going to take a look at in this video are dimensioned to be 10 inches by 10 inches. Now the significance of that is that since I have set the box joints up to be 1/16 of an inch of protrusion on the outside, that would mean if you were making a corresponding box, you would want to add an extra 1/16 on each end, or a total of 1/8 to the length to get you your finished size. So if we want a 10 inch by 10 inch box, then all four of these pieces would need to be cut 10 1/8 inches long for all four of them. Once the pieces are sanded, they will come out nice and flush, just like that. The next set of joints we're going to look at is your half-blind dovetail. And a half-blind dovetail is essentially where you see the joint from one side but not from the other. And this is where you have your pins and your tails. Now we've changed router bits, and even though this is a 1/2 inch diameter router bit and we were using a 1/2 inch on the other box joint, we still want to go through the symmetry process again just to make sure that nothing has changed. So quickly, for a refresher, we slide the fence forward until it just touches the cutter edge of the router bit. We adjust the true center until the 1/2 inch is right under the cursor. Slide the fence back, insert a piece of our stock between the fence and the bit, move the rabbet until the rabbet lines up with the carrot, remove the stock, slide the fence forward till the rabbet drops under the cursor, drop the cam lock to the 45-degree position, and then micro adjust as needed until the rabbet is dead under the cursor. And that then, once again, gives us true symmetry on our piece of stock. And we'll turn the insert over so that the slot is down now, and we can go over the router bit. Next, we want to refer again to the book, having marked the center point on our piece of stock, and then lay it over the appropriate template set in the book until we find the center point that we want for our cut. And when we locate that, we then move the template to the, so that that center point is under the cursor, and we should be ready to go. Now, the dovetails are different from the box joints in that on the dovetails, one set of the cuts are made vertical and one set are made horizontal. Also, on the dovetail, you have to be sure that your cuts, before you begin making your actual pieces, fit together snugly without having to pound them together. So what you would want to do is take and make a series of quick mating cuts and just fit it together. A good tip is to take and fit these pieces together and then try to pull them apart like this and see if there's any gap in between the two. If there is a gap, measure that gap and raise the router bit by that amount. The rule of thumb is heighten to tighten and lower to loosen. In other words, if you go to put this together and this is too sloppy, then you'll want to raise the bit a little bit and make another cut to adjust. If you cannot get these pieces together at all, then you'll need to lower the router bit a little bit to get the fit that you want. Now, in the book, on each page that has dovetails, it gives you some pertinent information regarding that individual cut, that individual dovetail. For example, here in the book, we're doing half-inch equally spaced dovetails. It says to use router bit or template number 10. Up here it says that we're using a half-inch dovetail bit with 14 degrees. It says over here that your depth of cut is going to be 9/32. You'll see what the rabbited depth is here in a few minutes. It's approximately 5/32. And the spacing pattern from center to center is 7/8 of an inch. Now all of these things work together to give you some very nice dovetails. This angle on the dovetail bit is somewhat variable depending upon the manufacturer of the bit. And as the dovetail bit changes in angle, that's going to change the depth of cut. Generally, the wider the angle, the shallower the cut, and the narrower the angle, the deeper the cut will be. Now, we'll slide the fence over, lock it in place on our first set of black lines, since that's the lines that we'll be using to start with. And again, we have a backer block. We'll put that in there. We'll slide all of our stock forward till we're over the dovetail bit. Bring the stop block in, and once again that will stop us from going too far back in and damaging the vertical push fixture. And just as with the box joints, we will clamp our stock in place, making sure that we're down snug against the table, in snug against the fence, and we'll start making our first series of cuts. Now again, we flip the stock end for end. snap everything in place. Return to our first mark and repeat the series. Now that completes the cuts on our tail board. Now this is called the tail board because if you look at the pieces, they look like birds or doves' tails. The mating pieces that fit in horizontally are called the pins, and that's the next set of cuts that we're going to achieve. Now, all of the pin cuts are created with the stock laying down flat and run in to the router bit in this manner. So we will be using the stop block to help limit our depth of cut. And what we'll want to do is set the stop block, as we did earlier in the video, to help us not cut too far back into the material. So what we want to do is bring the stop block up till it just touches the cutter edge, lock it in place, then slide the outfeed tape up until the zero lines up with this front edge. Lift the stop block up, slide it across the cutter until the opposite side lines up with zero. Now, that means if we look right straight down on the stop block, this edge lines up with the front side of the router bit, right dead on. The router bit diameter is 1/2 inch in diameter, so what we want to do is just move the stop block back by the diameter of the router bit. And that's 1/2 inch, so we'll move that back, then lower the stop block down so that it will come in contact with our piece of wood as we move it forward. And that will give us the depth of cut that we need for the socket to create the pins. Now we use the opposite set of lines to those that we used previously for cutting the tails. Now one thing that you'll notice when you go to make the pin cuts is that you will need to take, and in order to get the opposite corner, you have to rotate the board 180 degrees. Now, these pieces should fit right together. Which they do. But the stock does protrude out a little bit because we're trying to fit a square-edged tail into a round-ended socket. So what we have to do now is to rabbet the back edge of the tails so that they will fit all the way down into the grooves or the slots for the pins. Now a good way to do that is to take and touch, lay your piece of stock down so the pin board is down flat, and touch the pin board against your router bit. Then slide your fence forward until the fence just touches the tail board. And the amount of stock, or the amount of bit that is left protruding, is actually the amount of stock that needs to be removed to create the proper rabbeted area to fit these tails into the pin board. Now that amount of stock right there is quite a bit, so what you want to do is take this off in several bites. Don't try to take it all off at one pass. Now that last cut that I took in making the rabbet was a very small, light cut, so that when we fit the pieces together, the pins will stick out, again, just slightly more or slightly farther than the face of the tail board. And the purpose, once again, for that is so that when we go to sand the box, once it's glued together, you will be able to sand away the end grain on the pin board, and that will then make this nice and flush. And this is an example of the finished box with the finished joints. The next set of cuts we're going to look at is one that's somewhat unique to the JoinTech clincher system, and that is making a through dovetail cut without the aid of any type of fancy jigging devices. Most through dovetails require a series of different types of bits, collars, and a relatively expensive jig just to allow you to mate these two pieces of wood together. I'm going to show you a way to do this that uses one router bit and gives you very nicely constructed through dovetails. Now again, I've run a series of test cuts just to make sure that I have the right depth of cut. I referred once again to the page in the book for half-inch through dovetails, and we're using half-inch stock, and it said that my depth of cut would be at approximately 1/2 of an inch. So I've got that set up. I have once again zeroed the fence so that we are again set up for our symmetry. We're set up on the center of our board. I have installed the appropriate template for the half-inch through dovetails. Now, we'll look at the book and we'll pick the center that we want. And we will slide that under the cursor, just like that. And we'll be ready to cut. Now the one thing that you have to bear in mind when doing the through dovetails is that this is very, very precise with the thickness of stock. In other words, you can't make, let's say, 9/16 inch thick through dovetails on stock. You have to make it with whatever comes with the templates in the book, such as 1/2 inch on 1/2 inch stock, and that's what we're going to do. There are several different types of dovetails that you can do with different thicknesses, but you have to use the thicknesses that are recommended by the book. So again, we will move to the 0 point to our first cut. And similar to the cuts that we made with the box joints, the first series of cuts on both boards are all made in the vertical manner. So we'll mark one edge. We'll get us a scrap piece of stock. We will slide on the vertical push fixture. Again, set the stop block. And begin making our series of cuts. Again, you split the stock end for end. That gives us our first series of cuts. Now the second series of cuts are made exactly the same way. Again, we mark the side that goes into the fence. We put our piece of scrap stock on. But this time around, we use the opposite set of marks. We use the black dashed lines for the first series of cuts. So we will use the solid red lines for the next series of cuts. the trick will be to take these pieces and mate them to these pieces so that they slide together and actually make a set of dovetails. Both of our pieces of stock were cut in the vertical position. What we now need to do is to create or to make one of these into a pin board. The walnut piece is going to be our tail board, so it is finished as far as the cuts go on it. The light colored piece is going to be the pin board. So there's a second set of cuts that need to be manufactured on this in order to make it fit into the dovetailed slots in this manner. Now the only thing that changes at all on this cut is the fact that these boards are run laying flat down on the table as opposed to being vertical. What we want to do is take and drop the piece of stock over the router bit and slide it up until the inside of the cut just comes short of touching the cutter edge of the router bit. Then we can drop the stop block down and adjust the stop block so that it will prevent the piece of wood from going all the way in and being scalloped out down here in the bottom area. Now, two key things when you're running this. First of all, on all the cuts, the bottom has to be against the fence at all times. So do not feed forward this way and then turn it around and feed it this way. You will make an error. What we need to do is feed all the pieces forward this way, then we'll come back and we'll adjust the stop block and come back this way to make the final cuts. So, here we go. Now, that creates our first set of pins. To do the opposite end, we take and move the stop block back to this side, to the infeed side. Rotate the router bit. Set the piece of stock down to where you're just short of touching the bit. Move the stop block forward. And in this case here, we're just going to touch the edge of the stop block with the router bit. So let's raise that up just a little bit. There we go. Now, in everything you've ever read, it's always said not to climb cut or not to run your piece of wood with the rotation of the router bit. And that's what I'm now telling you that you need to do. But bear in mind that the majority of the stock has already been removed from this cut. All you're doing is just removing tiny little wedges of material from these upper edges. So it's not going to run on you, and with the stop block, even if it does, it'll only run just as far as the stop block is. And since you're using a push block, that will help to control it further. So just take your time. Now, at this point, the joint will actually start to fit together. But since a round router bit made the cut, you're going to have a couple of small little ears in each one of the corners of the pin pieces. So in order to make the assembly a little bit easier, what we want to do is remove those little ears. And you can do that fairly quickly with a sharp hand chisel. Now all you want to do is just take and lay the chisel right flat in against the face of the pin and push forward. And that will slice that little ear or that little nib away. Once the pins are trimmed, you can begin assembly of the box. Now, these pieces are a little on the snug side since there's a little bit of handwork involved. So what I'm going to do is just get them part way inserted into my tail boards. Line up the bottoms. And then we'll use a block and a soft mallet to tap these in. Now once again, the stock was machined so that there's just a slight bit of the ends of the tails and the pins sticking out across the face of the mating piece. And that way, then, when you come back and sand your piece of stock, you will get a nice, flush dovetail.